Young slave boy saves his master's wife from a fire. Then everything changed. The summer of 1832 descended upon the Harrington plantation like a suffocating blanket, the Georgia heat pressing down on the vast cotton fields that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Samuel wiped the sweat from his brow as he carried firewood into the kitchen house, his 16-year-old frame lean and hardened from years of labor. The kitchen stood separate from the main house, as was customary, to prevent fires from spreading to the grand colonial mansion where the Harrington family resided. Samuel had worked in the kitchen since he was 12, learning to prepare elaborate meals under the watchful eye of old Martha, the head cook. He was quick-witted and observant, traits that had kept him from the brutal labor in the fields where other slaves worked from dawn until dusk under the merciless sun and the overseer's whip. Yet he knew his position was precarious. One mistake could send him to those same fields, or worse. That afternoon, Mrs. Elizabeth Harrington had requested candles for the evening's dinner party. Samuel delivered them to the small room adjacent to the main parlor where the household stored candelabras and lighting supplies. Elizabeth, just 20 years old, had married Mr. Richard Harrington 2 years prior in an arrangement between wealthy families. She was beautiful, with auburn hair that caught the light like copper and green eyes that seemed to hold a perpetual sadness. Samuel had noticed this about her, the way her smiles never quite reached those eyes, how she would stare out windows as if searching for something beyond the manicured gardens. As Samuel arranged the candles on the shelf, he heard Elizabeth's footsteps in the hallway. She entered the room, startled to see him. "Samuel, I didn't know you were here," she said softly, her voice carrying the refined accent of Charleston society. "Just finishing up, ma'am," Samuel replied, keeping his eyes lowered as was expected. No slave should look directly at the master's wife. Elizabeth moved to inspect the candle arrangement, but her dress brushed against one of the lit tapers Samuel had used to see in the dim room. Neither noticed immediately as the fabric caught, a small flame beginning to climb the layers of her elaborate gown. By the time Elizabeth gasped, the fire had grown. She stumbled backward in panic and the flame spread to the curtains. Within seconds, the room was engulfed, smoke billowing thick and black. Samuel's instincts overrode every rule he'd ever been taught about never touching the mistress. He lunged forward, tearing the burning curtain down with his bare hands, throwing it aside. Elizabeth had fallen, her dress aflame, coughing violently from the smoke. Without hesitation, Samuel grabbed her, his hands finding purchase despite the heat, and dragged her toward the door. The flames licked at his shirt, burning through the thin fabric. Pain seared across his arms and back, but he didn't stop. He pulled Elizabeth through the doorway and into the hallway, then out onto the front veranda where he finally released her, collapsing beside her as house slaves rushed toward them with buckets of water. The fire was contained within the hour, the room destroyed but the main house saved. Samuel's burns were superficial but painful, his clothing singed black. Elizabeth had fared better, with only minor burns on her arms where her dress had caught. As the household descended into chaos, Mr. Harrington arriving home to survey the damage, Elizabeth sat on the veranda steps, staring at Samuel as he was tended to by Martha. "He saved my life," Elizabeth whispered to her husband when he demanded to know what had happened. "The boy pulled me from the flames." Mr. Harrington regarded Samuel with cold calculation. "You did well," he said finally, his voice devoid of warmth. "You'll receive extra rations this week." That was all. No further acknowledgement. But something had changed in the way Elizabeth looked at Samuel, a recognition that went beyond the boundaries that separated them. The weeks following the fire brought an unexpected shift in Samuel's duties. Elizabeth requested that he help with tasks around the main house, bringing fresh linens, tending the garden visible from her sitting room window, delivering messages to the kitchen. Mr. Harrington, often away on business in Savannah or inspecting the cotton fields, paid little attention to these domestic arrangements. Samuel found himself in Elizabeth's presence more frequently, though always under the pretense of legitimate work. At first, their interactions remained proper, confined to brief instructions and polite acknowledgments. But gradually, something unspoken began to grow between them. It started with small gestures. Elizabeth would ensure Samuel received water on particularly hot days when he worked in the garden. Once, she left a salve for his burns where he would find it, with no note or explanation needed. Samuel, in turn, would place fresh flowers from the garden on the windowsill of her sitting room, arrangements he knew she favored. One afternoon, while Samuel was repairing a broken shutter outside Elizabeth's room, she stepped onto the small balcony. The plantation was quiet, Mr. Harrington having left for a 3-day trip to Charleston. "Samuel," she said quietly, and for the first time he allowed himself to look directly at her face. The moment their eyes met, something electric passed between them, an acknowledgement of the connection they had both been feeling but couldn't name. Elizabeth's breath caught, and she gripped the balcony railing. "I wanted to thank you properly," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "for saving my life. My husband, he doesn't understand the courage it took." "I didn't think, ma'am," Samuel replied honestly. "I just acted." "That's precisely what makes it remarkable." She paused, seeming to struggle with her words. "You see me as a person, don't you? Not just as the mistress of this house." Samuel should have lowered his gaze, should have returned to his work, should have remembered every brutal lesson he'd learned about the distance between master and slave. Instead, he said quietly, "Yes, ma'am, I do." The confession hung in the air between them, dangerous and irrevocable. "I'm so lonely here," Elizabeth whispered, and Samuel heard the desperation in her voice. "My husband is a stranger to me. This life, these rules, these expectations. I feel like I'm suffocating." "I understand, ma'am," Samuel said, though he knew his understanding came from a different kind of imprisonment. Their conversations became longer, more intimate. Elizabeth would ask about his life, his thoughts, his dreams, questions no white person had ever asked him. Samuel found himself sharing memories of his mother, who had been sold away when he was 8, of his hope that someday he might learn to read, of the stars he studied at night from his quarters. Elizabeth, in turn, revealed her own captivity. The marriage arranged for wealth and status, the husband who saw her as an ornament, the suffocating expectations of Southern womanhood that allowed her no voice, no agency, no purpose beyond producing heirs and hosting parties. In those stolen moments, they found something neither had known before: genuine understanding, connection, and the dangerous spark of something deeper. One evening, as dusk painted the sky purple and gold, Samuel was trimming the roses near the back veranda. Elizabeth appeared, wrapped in a shawl despite the warmth, and stood at the railing. "Do you ever imagine a different life?" she asked, not looking at him. "Every day, ma'am," Samuel replied, his hands stilling on the shears. "What would it look like? Your different life?" Samuel knew he should lie, should speak only of freedom in the abstract. Instead, he found himself saying, "A life where I could speak freely, where I could choose my own path, where—" He hesitated, then continued, "where two people who understand each other could simply exist together without the world tearing them apart." Elizabeth turned to him then, and in her eyes Samuel saw tears glistening. "That's a beautiful dream," she whispered, "and an impossible one." "I know, ma'am." "Elizabeth," she said suddenly, "when we're alone like this, call me Elizabeth." "I can't." "Please." Her voice broke. "I need someone to see me as myself, just once." "Elizabeth," Samuel breathed, the name feeling both sacred and forbidden on his tongue. She smiled then, truly smiled, and Samuel felt his heart constrict with an emotion he'd never experienced before: love, terrible and doomed and undeniable. Their secret moments continued through late summer. Elizabeth began leaving small notes hidden in places only Samuel would find, under the garden tools, tucked into the linens he delivered, pressed between the pages of household books. The notes contained nothing incriminating, just simple words. Thank you for the flowers. The sunset was beautiful today. I hope you are well. Samuel couldn't write, but he communicated through gestures, a particular flower that meant he'd read her note, a specific arrangement that conveyed his thoughts. They developed their own language, invisible to everyone else, but nothing stayed secret forever on a plantation where everyone watched everyone else, where slaves reported to overseers and house servants whispered to masters. It was Prudence, Mrs. Harrington's lady's maid, who first noticed the unusual attention Elizabeth paid to the young kitchen slave. She observed the lengthy conversations, the lingering glances, the way Elizabeth's face would brighten when Samuel appeared. Prudence, who had served the Harrington family for 20 years and feared losing her privileged position, spoke to Mr. Harrington upon his return from a business trip. Sir, I hesitate to mention this, but as a faithful servant of this household, I feel it my duty, Prudence began carefully. There have been inappropriate interactions between Mrs. Harrington and the boy Samuel. Richard Harrington's face darkened. Explain yourself. They speak privately, sir. Too often and too long. She requests his presence for tasks that others could perform. I've seen her smile at him in ways that aren't proper, sir. Harrington said nothing, but his jaw clenched. Over the following days, he watched, and what he saw confirmed his worst suspicions, not of any physical transgression, but of something perhaps more dangerous, genuine affection between his wife and a slave. The breaking point came on a sweltering afternoon in early September. Elizabeth, believing her husband was in town, had asked Samuel to bring her a book from the library. When he delivered it, she had pressed a note into his hand, a brief message thanking him for being the only light in these dark days. Samuel was reading the note, his lips moving slowly over the words he was learning to decipher with Elizabeth's subtle coaching, when Mr. Harrington stepped into the hallway behind him. What is that? Harrington's voice cut through the air like a blade. Samuel spun around, the note still in his hand. Fear flooded through him. He knew that expression, had seen it on masters' faces before slaves were whipped or sold or killed. Answer me, boy. What are you holding? Nothing, sir. Just... Harrington strode forward and snatched the paper from Samuel's hand. His face went white as he read it, then red with rage. Where is my wife? Before Samuel could answer, Elizabeth appeared on the stairs, drawn by her husband's raised voice. She saw the note in his hand and went pale. Richard, I can explain. Explain? His voice was dangerously quiet. Explain how you've been writing notes to a slave. Explain how you've allowed this thing to develop under my own roof. He saved my life, Elizabeth said desperately. I was merely expressing gratitude. Gratitude? Harrington's laugh was harsh. I've watched you, Elizabeth. I've seen how you look at him. Do you have any idea what people would say if this became known? What they would think of you? Of me? Nothing has happened, Elizabeth insisted, though tears streamed down her face. We've only talked. Harrington turned to Samuel, who stood frozen, head bowed. You dare raise your eyes to my wife? You dare to think yourself worthy of her attention? No, sir, Samuel whispered. I never meant. Get him out of my sight, Harrington snapped to the overseer, who had appeared, drawn by the commotion. Take him to the fields. I want him working under the sun until he remembers his place. Richard, please. Elizabeth reached out to her husband, but he jerked away from her touch. You are confined to this house, he told her coldly. You will have no contact with any slave without supervision. Prudence will attend you at all times. He turned back to the overseer. And spread the word. Any slave caught speaking to Mrs. Harrington without explicit purpose will receive 20 lashes. Is that understood? Yes, sir, the overseer replied, grabbing Samuel's arm roughly. As Samuel was dragged away, he looked back once and saw Elizabeth standing on the stairs, her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes locked on his. In that moment, they both understood their brief connection, their fleeting happiness, was over. The transition from kitchen work to field labor was brutal. Samuel was assigned to the cotton fields, where slaves worked in gangs from first light to last, picking until their fingers bled, their backs bent under the merciless sun. The overseer, Mr. Jenkins, a cruel man who took pleasure in his authority, made sure Samuel understood his new reality. On the first day, Samuel was made an example. Before the assembled field slaves, Jenkins addressed them all. This boy forgot his place, thought he was too good for field work, thought he could get familiar with the mistress of the house. Let this be a lesson to all of you about what happens when you get ideas above your station. The whip came down 20 times across Samuel's back, each strike a line of fire. He bit down on a leather strap to keep from crying out, refusing to give Jenkins the satisfaction. When it was over, he was given no time to recover. He was handed a cotton sack and pushed into the field. The physical pain was excruciating, but Samuel discovered something worse, the systematic crushing of his spirit. Every aspect of his new existence was designed to remind him that he was property, nothing more. He slept in a cramped cabin with 15 other field hands, on a dirt floor with only a thin blanket. The food was minimal, cornmeal and whatever scraps could be salvaged. Water was scarce, rationed during the long days, but the hardest torture was proximity to the main house. From the fields, Samuel could see the white columns of the mansion, could imagine Elizabeth inside, wondering about him. At night, he could see lights in the windows and imagined her in her room, thinking thoughts he would never know. The other slaves kept their distance at first, wary of the boy who had drawn the master's particular anger. But gradually, some showed kindness. An older man named Jacob would share extra water from his ration. A woman named Ruth would make sure Samuel got slightly larger portions of the evening meal. They understood what it meant to love something forbidden, to long for connection in a world designed to isolate and dehumanize. "You fell for her, didn't you?" Jacob asked one night as they sat outside the cabin, too hot to sleep inside. Samuel didn't answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. "I had a wife once," Jacob continued quietly, "before I was sold here. Master's son took a liking to her. When she refused him, they sold her down to Mississippi. Haven't seen her in 12 years. He looked at Samuel in the darkness. "At least you got to know what it felt like, even for a little while, to be seen as human by someone who didn't have to see you that way." Samuel's eyes burned with unshed tears. "Does it get easier?" "No," Jacob said honestly, "but you learn to carry it. You learn that love, even impossible love, is better than feeling nothing at all." Inside the main house, Elizabeth was living her own version of imprisonment. Richard had made good on his promise. Prudence followed her everywhere, a silent shadow ensuring no impropriety. Elizabeth was forbidden from going near the windows that overlooked the fields, from walking in the garden, from any activity that might allow her even a glimpse of Samuel. Richard's punishment extended beyond mere surveillance. He made it clear that her behavior had shamed him, had called into question his ability to control his own household. At dinner parties, he would make subtle comments about wives who didn't understand their place, about the importance of maintaining proper boundaries. Elizabeth endured it all in silence, knowing that any protest would only make things worse. But she thought of Samuel constantly. At night, she would lie awake wondering if he was safe, if he was being treated cruelly, if he thought of her. She had no way of knowing that he slept in the fields, exhausted and in pain, dreaming of her voice, her smile, the brief moments when they had been simply two people who understood each other. One afternoon, when Richard was away and Prudence had briefly stepped out, Elizabeth made her way to the window facing the fields. She scanned the figures bent over the cotton plants, searching for Samuel. When she finally spotted him, his once healthy frame now gaunt, his movements slow with exhaustion, she had to grip the windowsill to keep from crying out. "Mrs. Harrington, you shouldn't be at that window." Prudence's voice came from behind her. Elizabeth didn't turn around. "He's suffering because of me." "He's suffering because he forgot his place," Prudence replied without sympathy, "as you seem to forget yours." Elizabeth finally turned, meeting Prudence's cold gaze. "Have you never loved, Prudence? Have you never felt your heart pulled towards someone you couldn't have?" Something flickered in Prudence's eyes. A memory, a pain of her own, but her expression remained stern. "What I feel or don't feel is irrelevant. I know my place, and I keep to it. You would do well to do the same." After Prudence left, Elizabeth sat at her writing desk and penned words she would never be able to send. "Forgive me. Forgive me for the pain my affection has caused you. Forgive me for not being strong enough to hide my heart. Forgive me for dooming you to this suffering. If I could trade places with you, if I could take your pain upon myself, I would do so without hesitation. You deserved better than what this cruel world has given you." She folded the letter and hid it in her diary, knowing Samuel would never read it, knowing the words were futile. But she needed to write them, needed to acknowledge the depth of her feeling, even if only to herself. 3 months passed. Summer turned to autumn, and the cotton harvest began in earnest. Samuel had adapted to field life as much as anyone could. His body had grown harder, more resilient, though the memory of his former life felt increasingly distant. Yet his heart had not adapted. Every day he carried the weight of his feelings for Elizabeth, a burden more crushing than any bale of cotton. The plantation prepared for the harvest celebration, an annual event where neighboring plantation owners would gather. For the slaves, it meant extra work, preparing food, cleaning the grounds, serving the guests. Samuel was pulled from field duty to help with preparations, and for the first time in months, he would be near the main house again. Elizabeth knew Samuel would be close, and despite Prudence's watchful presence, she felt both terror and desperate longing. On the evening of the celebration, as guests milled about the grounds and house slaves circulated with trays of food and drink, Elizabeth stood on the veranda, scanning the crowd for a glimpse of him. When she finally saw Samuel carrying firewood to the outdoor cooking area, her breath caught. He was thinner, his clothes hanging loosely, his face gaunt, but his eyes, when he glanced up toward the house, still held that same intelligence, that same soul that had connected with hers. Their eyes met across the distance. For just a moment, the pretense fell away. Elizabeth's hand went to her heart, and Samuel paused in his work, memorizing her face as if it were the last time he would ever see her. Richard appeared at Elizabeth's side, following her gaze. "I see you've spotted your former friend," he said coldly. "Does he look well to you? Does field work agree with him?" "You're cruel," Elizabeth whispered. "I'm appropriate," Richard corrected. "I maintain order. Perhaps now you understand why such order is necessary." But then Richard did something unexpected. He called to the overseer and said, loud enough for Elizabeth to hear, "Jenkins, I want that boy back in the kitchen. He's wasted in the fields. Martha's been complaining she needs help." Elizabeth looked at her husband in shock. "Why?" Richard's expression was unreadable. "Because I'm not a monster, Elizabeth, and because I want you to see that mercy is mine to grant, not yours to earn through inappropriate attachments." He paused. "He returns to the kitchen tomorrow, but understand, this is not kindness. This is me demonstrating my power. His life, his comfort, his suffering, all of it exists at my discretion. Remember that." Samuel was indeed returned to the kitchen the next day. The work was still hard, but it was infinitely better than the fields. Martha, who had missed his quick hands and quicker mind, welcomed him back with a gruff tenderness that reminded Samuel there were still small kindnesses in the world. But the rules had changed. Samuel was forbidden from any task that would bring him into Elizabeth's presence. If she entered the kitchen house, he was to leave immediately. They existed in the same space but were kept carefully apart, like two stars in the same sky that would never touch. Yet they found ways to communicate. Elizabeth would leave her used teacup on the kitchen steps with a pattern of remaining tea leaves that Samuel learned to read. Symbols they had invented during their brief time together. A cluster meant, "I think of you." A line meant, "Be strong." A circle meant, "I'm well." Samuel would respond by arranging vegetables or firewood in specific patterns outside the kitchen house, visible from Elizabeth's window. They were minuscule gestures, almost pathetic in their smallness, but they were all they had. Tiny affirmations that what they had shared was real, that it persisted despite everything designed to destroy it. Winter came to Georgia, bringing cold nights and shorter days. The plantation settled into its quieter season, though work never truly stopped. Samuel fell into a routine that was both comfort and torment. Comfort in its predictability, torment in the constant nearness and unreachability of Elizabeth. He would catch glimpses of her, through windows, walking in the garden with Prudence shadowing her, sitting on the veranda wrapped in a shawl. She looked frailer than before, as if the separation had hollowed her out from the inside. Samuel understood completely, for he felt the same way. In the slave quarters at night, Jacob would sometimes ask Samuel about his feelings. "Still carrying that torch?" the older man would say. "Can't seem to put it down," Samuel would reply. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe carrying it means you're still alive inside, still capable of feeling something other than fear and exhaustion." Samuel wasn't sure if that was wisdom or just another form of torture. To love when love was impossible. Was that courage or foolishness? He couldn't decide. Meanwhile, Elizabeth lived in her own prison of silk and silver. Richard treated her with cold civility, maintaining appearances for society while making clear her transgression had not been forgiven. At night, she would take out the letters she had written to Samuel, reading them to herself, imagining his voice responding. One particularly cold night in January, Elizabeth fell ill with a fever. The doctor was called, and while he prescribed rest and medicine, it was clear to everyone that her illness was as much of the spirit as of the body. She was wasting away, not from any physical malady, but from the slow suffocation of her soul. Samuel heard about her illness from Martha, who clucked her tongue sympathetically. "That poor woman, she's dying of loneliness up in that big house." Samuel's hands stilled in their work. Will she recover?" Martha looked at him with ancient, knowing eyes. "From the fever?" "Yes. From what's really ailing her." She shook her head. "Some wounds don't heal, child." On the third night of Elizabeth's illness, Samuel made a decision that could cost him everything. He waited until the house was quiet, until the last lights had been extinguished, and then he crept from his quarters to the main house. His heart pounded as he slipped through shadows, avoiding the night watchman, moving like a ghost toward Elizabeth's room. He climbed the trellis outside her window, the same one he had once repaired, and tapped gently on the glass. Inside, Elizabeth stirred from her feverish sleep. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming, but then she saw his face in the moonlight, pressed against the window, and she struggled to rise. She opened the window, and for the first time in 5 months, they were face to face with nothing between them. "You shouldn't be here," Elizabeth whispered, but her hand reached out to touch his face, confirming he was real. "I know," Samuel replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But I heard you were sick, and I couldn't stay away." Tears streamed down Elizabeth's face. "I've missed you so much, every day, every moment." "And I you," Samuel said. "Elizabeth, I need you to know, what we had, what we felt, it was real, it mattered, it still matters." "Yes," she breathed, "it was real." They stood like that for several long moments, hands clasped through the window, drinking in each other's presence. Neither dared to do more. They both knew the consequences would be catastrophic. "I can't stay," Samuel finally said, though every fiber of his being wanted to remain. "But I needed you to know you're not alone. Even when we can't see each other, even when they keep us apart, you're not alone." "Neither are you," Elizabeth replied. "Samuel, promise me something. Promise me you'll survive this. Promise me you'll find moments of happiness, even small ones. Promise me our connection won't become just another thing that destroys you." "I promise," Samuel said, though he didn't know if it was a promise he could keep. "And you promise me the same." "I promise," Elizabeth whispered. Samuel climbed back down the trellis and disappeared into the night. Elizabeth closed the window and returned to her bed, and for the first time in months, she slept peacefully. The fever broke by morning. The following years blurred together in a pattern of near misses and stolen glances. Samuel remained in the kitchen, growing into his late teens and then early 20s. Elizabeth continued her role as Mrs. Harrington, hosting parties, maintaining the household, playing the part society demanded. They lived in parallel worlds that occasionally intersected but never merged. Richard never forgot what had happened, but his surveillance eventually relaxed. He seemed to take satisfaction in having asserted his control, in having demonstrated that even his wife's affections were subject to his authority. He had broken their connection, or so he believed. What Richard didn't understand was that some connections couldn't be broken, only buried. Samuel and Elizabeth carried each other in their hearts like secret talismans, sources of both pain and strange comfort. In a world that sought to dehumanize them both, Samuel as property, Elizabeth as property with better clothes, their memory of genuine connection became a form of resistance, proof that they were more than what the world said they were. Samuel learned to find small joys, the satisfaction of a well-prepared meal, the beauty of stars on clear nights, the camaraderie of fellow slaves who became his second family. Jacob taught him to read better, using a Bible stolen from the main house. Ruth shared stories of her grandmother who had been free in Africa, keeping alive the memory of a world before bondage. Elizabeth also found ways to survive. She began teaching the house slaves' children to read in secret, a dangerous act, but one that gave her purpose. She corresponded with her sister in Charleston, letters that contained carefully coded references to her state of mind. And she watched Samuel from afar, noting when he looked healthy, when he seemed burdened, when he smiled at something Jacob said. One spring morning in 1835, 3 years after the fire that had changed everything, Elizabeth stood at her window and watched Samuel in the garden. He was arranging stones around a new flower bed, and she realized he was spelling something, a word visible only from her window. Hope. She pressed her hand to the glass, her eyes filling with tears. He had arranged stones to spell hope where only she would see it. It was an affirmation, a message across the impossible divide. We endure, we survive, we hope. Elizabeth took a piece of paper and wrote a single word, then folded it into a tiny square. Later that day, she dropped it near where Samuel was working. He found it that evening, unfolded it, and read the words she had written. Always, as months became years, both Samuel and Elizabeth came to understand the bitter truth of their situation. They would never be together, not in any real sense. The world they lived in would never allow it. But that understanding brought with it a strange kind of peace. The peace of acceptance, of choosing to love anyway despite impossible circumstances. Samuel was now in his early 20s, a young man who had learned to carry an impossible love as part of his being, like a scar that never quite healed but no longer bled. He found meaning in small acts of kindness, in the community of fellow slaves, in moments of beauty that punctuated the brutality of his existence. Elizabeth, now 25, had learned to wear her mask so perfectly that few suspected the depths of loneliness beneath. She had never conceived children, a fact that disappointed Richard but which she secretly considered a mercy. She couldn't bear to bring new life into this cruel system. She poured her maternal instincts into helping the slave children, teaching them in secret, knowing education was one small weapon against the dehumanization they faced. One autumn afternoon, as preparations began for another harvest celebration, Samuel and Elizabeth found themselves unexpectedly alone in the garden. Prudence had been called away, and Richard was in town. It was the first time in years they had been truly alone. They stood several feet apart, neither daring to move closer. "How are you?" Elizabeth asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I survive," Samuel replied. "And you?" "The same." A long silence stretched between them, filled with everything they couldn't say. "Do you ever regret it?" Elizabeth finally asked. "Saving me that day? Everything that came after?" Samuel considered the question carefully. "No," he said finally, "because knowing you, even in the way I've known you, even with all the pain that followed, it showed me that there's more to this world than cruelty. That connection is possible, even when everything is designed to prevent it." "I feel the same," Elizabeth whispered. "You've been my anchor, Samuel. The knowledge that someone sees me as more than just a possession, it's kept me sane." "We're both prisoners," Samuel observed quietly. "Just in different ways." "Yes," Elizabeth agreed, "but knowing someone else understands that, it makes the prison bearable." They heard footsteps approaching, Prudence returning. In that last moment, Elizabeth said urgently, "If things had been different, if the world had been different—" "I know," Samuel interrupted gently. "I know." And then Prudence was there, her face stern, and the moment shattered. Elizabeth returned to the house, and Samuel returned to his work, and the world continued as it always had, cruel and unyielding. The story of Samuel and Elizabeth didn't end with dramatic resolution or escape. It ended as so many real stories of that era ended, with quiet endurance, with love that survived in the cracks between cruelty, with two people carrying each other in their hearts despite a world determined to keep them apart. Samuel continued his work at the Harrington plantation, finding meaning in small rebellions, teaching others to read, preserving dignity where the system sought to destroy it, holding on to hope when hope seemed foolish. Elizabeth continued her role as the plantation mistress, using what small power she had to ease suffering where she could, maintaining her secret school, surviving. They never spoke privately again after that afternoon in the garden, but they remained aware of each other, two souls connected by shared understanding in a world that denied their humanity. The fire that had brought them together had left scars, not just on their skin, but on their hearts. Yet those scars proved that they had lived, had felt, had loved, despite everything designed to prevent it. In the quiet moments when Samuel looked up at the stars or Elizabeth gazed out her window into the darkness, they would think of each other and find a strange comfort. Their love had been impossible, forbidden, and doomed from the start. But it had also been real, honest, and unbreakable in its way. They survived by carrying the memory of what they had shared, brief conversations, stolen glances, the knowledge that somewhere in this cruel world, someone understood. It wasn't the love story either had dreamed of. It was far more painful, far more complex. But it was theirs, and in a world that sought to deny them everything, that small possession of genuine feeling became an act of defiance. The plantation continued its cycles of planting and harvest. The years passed. The system that enslaved Samuel and imprisoned Elizabeth remained unchanged. But within that system, two people had found something that couldn't be taken from them, the memory of being seen, understood, and loved for who they truly were, if only for a brief and shining moment. And sometimes, in the darkest hours, that memory was enough to sustain hope, to endure another day, to survive in a world built on cruelty. Their love had changed nothing about the system that oppressed them, but it had changed everything about how they endured that oppression. That, perhaps, was the only victory available to them. The victory of remaining human in a world designed to strip away humanity, of loving despite every prohibition, of remembering that even in the darkest places, connection is possible. And so they lived, Samuel and Elizabeth, two hearts bound together across an uncrossable divide, carrying the weight of impossible love until their final days. Proof that even in the most brutal systems, the human heart finds ways to feel, to hope, and to love.